button if you have any questions. First, a quick shout out and thank you to the staff who helped make this meeting possible today. Glenn Giddings, Josiah Brock, Mike Peak, and Ryan McDaniel. Thank you. These guys are highly proficient. They're a very nimble team, and I'm glad to have their leadership, patience, and grace as we navigate this new technological universe amid the ongoing pandemic. I expect today's event to be the first of many like this in this format. We can only improve. Hopefully, more of us can join together in person over the coming months, but I think this is a pretty good start. I also want to thank Jake, kind of call him the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. So Jake, thank you for making this possible. All right, so let's get started. We've got a busy agenda today. I would like to bring you up to speed on our academic committees and where we are on this to date. Jake and I have had virtual meetings with the deans, the unit committee chairs for the Brandeis School of Law and the Speed School of Engineering. Marty McClelland is our chair for the Speed School of Engineering, and he and his colleagues have had a full committee meeting just last week. So thank you to all who were on the call. It was a very productive meeting. Jake and I were on it as well. Dean Emmanuel Collins reported out to the committee the challenges for the school and the successes the school are having. The successes are many, the challenges are many, but I think this committee is going to come together and help them get through many of those. They're working well, and they're well underway, as I said, and they're going to be reporting back to us very soon. Later this week, we're going to be holding similar meetings with the College of Business and the School of Public Health and Information Sciences with their unit committee chairs, deans, and respective development officers. The purpose of these meetings are to get the academic unit committees on track and moving forward to assist their respective schools and colleges. Rest assured, your full committee meetings will be soon. We are more than on track and moving forward. Next, I'm happy to introduce to you Sarah Exner, who's joining us virtually today. Many of you know Sarah as she coordinates the President's Council Mentoring Program and Committee from the Council's Honors House. That's a mouthful. Council's Honors House. Okay, I have had the pleasure of being on this committee for several years working with Sarah. I can tell you the Council's Mentor-Mentee program is excellent, and we have several very committed committee members who are on that committee. We have many mentors who've been willing to match with students year after year. Sarah, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. I'm gonna assume everyone can see and hear me. Thanks for inviting me to the meeting. Just to give you a short update, as Charlie mentioned, I help coordinate the program. I'm an advisor in the honors program. And then I also help with the mentoring program, and kind of giving you an update of just where we are, what our plans are heading into the fall semester. We did still wrap up a very successful program this past year. COVID-19 threw us all for a loop, student and mentors alike this past spring, but we still had a very successful end of the program. And we also were able to interview and select our next group of students for next year. So we have 50 students who are excited to be matched with mentors and to participate in any way they can come the fall. We have had to update the way we are going to proceed. We typically require our students to meet with their mentors in person, but we're shifting that a little bit to provide a little bit more flexibility, while we will still leave the in-person option open to both the student and mentor. We are going to encourage virtual meetings and phone calls instead, to provide a level of safety for both the mentors and mentees. We're finalizing those details and updating our handbook now, and so we'll be ready to give that out to our new mentors and mentees come the fall. We'll be meeting as a committee, the student mentoring committee, in the next week or two, so we'll be actually beginning the matching process, and so that's definitely where the President's Council can come in and help out. We every year are recruiting mentors from the local community to serve as mentors for these students, and so our committee is really responsible for reaching out to those business and social networks to handpick those mentors who we feel would be the best match for students. So we're always looking for more help with recruiting mentors with mentors. So if anyone on the council has an interest in serving as a mentor, please let me know, let Charlie know, or even Jake. We can all make sure we get connected if you're interested in helping. And then as course, we also have a gift account that we're always looking for donations to help with our programming for the students and the mentors. We do events throughout the year, and without those gifts, those wouldn't be possible. So if you can't donate your time, please consider donating a gift. But that's, I guess, just a short update from me. If there's anything else, please let me know.
Can you go to that microphone? Can you go to that microphone for me?
I feel like I'm on TV. So my question is, would you call the people that you want to appoint and make sure that they're going to be involved? Because we've had a lot of people in the past that are appointees, we never see them, they never do anything.
Right.
So just at least make sure they want to do it.
I've been there.
And I'll
been part
help
of
you
that.
twist their arms if you wish.
I understand.
Thanks.
Student mentoring.
What?
Student mentoring.
Good point, Dick. Thank you. Next is the report of the president. Neely is going to briefly update us on the university's plan to return this fall, as previously shared by Jake in his emails. Neely, floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, is this on? Oops, yes, it is. Hi, everybody. I have to say, I'm so happy to see you all. For an extrovert like me, being quarantined for this long has been a challenge. So it's good to see you all. I will keep my remarks brief. I want to thank everybody who's joined us online and the people who are here in person. It truly shows your dedication and commitment, and I'm so grateful for that. We are all signs still are that we will have students on our campus August 17th as scheduled. And we've posted detailed plans online, so I won't go through all of that because today we are really here to hear from Dean Reed, and I don't want to take too much time away from that. So we are excited. We are, so far I've talked to other presidents who say their enrollments are seeing very big drops. We are not seeing that yet. I mean, knock on wood, I cannot count it until they're all here. But I think that that's really credit to how we handled the spring. Why am I so optimistic about the fall? Many reasons. One, as you know, we're one of only 12 universities with the level 3 biosafety lab. That gives us the ability to do as much testing as we need to. I hope you are all following the co-immunity project, where we are testing all healthcare providers, not just in our system, but at Baptist and Norton and other hospitals, to see, first of all, with the COVID-19, the biggest challenge was availability of medical providers, the doctors and the nurses and the technicians. So that is a big advantage for us that we're monitoring and we're seeing how that's going. The second thing is that we never really closed, unlike other universities where they said students have to leave. Throughout the spring semester, we took care of about 2,700 students who chose this was their best option. This is their home. They were here. So we were safely able to make sure they had food, that they could go to the library, they could use the resources, and that's given us a boost in terms of our head start, in terms of how to keep ourselves open safely. So there's so much detail. There were two big committees, one that was the pivot to fall, how will we get ready for the fall? You can see that online. And if you have any questions, let me know. Beth Baim and others have been really working on the academics. The second group that's been working equally tirelessly is the Safe Return to Work Committee. And that is our Executive Vice President for Research, Kevin Gardner, and the head of our campus health services, Dr. Phil Brassoud. So they've been working very closely. We also are coordinating with the ACC, as well as with my fellow presidents there, as well as with the presidents of all the Kentucky-based institutions. We always will keep our student, faculty, and staff health and safety first. But as I said, we are optimistic and excited if things continue as they are in Kentucky, and we will make changes. We will have to make adjustments in terms of we need to be ready to turn on a dime if something changes, to be able to move to hybrid classes, to figure out to have a dedicated location, which we do. If someone gets identified as having been exposed to COVID-19, how will we take care of them? What will we do, etc. But all the information is online, and in the interest of time, what I would like to do, Charlie, is have you introduce our speaker and get us going. I do want to say thank you to John McCall. When Teresa Reed sent a note, it just meant so much to me that I decided to share it with all of you with her permission. And after reading it, John reached out immediately and said, how can we have a conversation? So I will just add one more thing. In planning for the fall, we are going to be discussing how to be anti-racist. You know, the idea is that, and I think that Louisville, Kentucky, here, we are uniquely positioned for that, because the idea is we want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to succeed. The thing that's standing between a lot of people and greatness is opportunity. And that's our job, to transform lives through higher education. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. Are there questions, Jake? Please.
We do have two questions right now. The first question, and I wish I knew who this was from, so I apologize ahead of time. But the first question is, we are seeing notification that men's basketball is being suspended due to COVID. Is that true?
It's not suspended. What happened was a staff member contracted it, so we said, this is actually a trial for us to see how we quarantine for 2 weeks. And I don't want to go into more details, but it's out there. And so we are following all the protocols that we need to.
The next question is, what is the state of U of L finances?
Actually, we're happy to send you. I think we sent you the details of the presentation to the board, but we'll send it again. It's a challenging time for every university. I am glad about one thing, though. 2 years ago, if this had happened, we would have had to declare financial exigency. There was no way we could have survived it. But in the summer, we worked very hard to have, Dan Durbin gets the credit for it, of corralling everybody and really leading those conversations. So for the summer, what we were able to do was have a balanced budget by taking tough measures. We had to stop retirement contributions. We had a pay cuts taken, which were progressive. So the more you made, the bigger percentage cut you took, etc. So for the fall, we're watching very, very closely. As you know, about 10% of our budget comes from the state. When we're a public university, you all probably think it's a gigantic percentage. It's really not anymore. We are concerned about that, but we feel confident. We've presented to the board a budget with a number of triggers, what we would do. If this happens, what would we do? There are unknowns. What happens with academics, with the students being back on campus? What happens with athletics? But we are planning for every contingency. So we did a very pessimistic case, most likely case, an optimistic case, as you would imagine. So we've done our scenario planning. I would say it's going to be tough with philanthropy, with so many things. So we ask our friends and family to please keep us in mind, because this will be tough, but I feel confident that we are actually decently well positioned. Very grateful we were able to save the hospital system when we did. You know, none of us knew the pandemic would come around, but just the thought of everything going on and not having Jewish hospital and not having St. Mary's and Elizabeth, and all of these would have been, I can't even imagine how devastating that would have been. So all of those are performing as we expect. So we feel cautiously optimistic.
And then one more question, and that is, how is the hospital merger going?
Actually, really well. And Tom Miller and his team, Jake, I was trying to be so fast, I probably shouldn't have. A reminder to all of you, University President, what are the areas that report up to me and how do I spend my time? The academics we talked about briefly, and that is Beth Bain, the Chief Academic Officer, the classroom instruction. Research, that would be Kevin Gardner, and really looking at, and I hope you've been watching, incredible research coming out of UFL to respond to COVID-19 and beyond. That's another area. A third area is athletics, and Vince Tyree and his shop, they're doing everything they can to prepare for what would happen. And every contingency. Right now, if you ask me, I cannot tell you 100% that there will be fans in the stands and it'll be exactly as before, but we're cautiously optimistic. We'll have to see with great care what happens there. The fourth area is healthcare. As you know, that's a big thing. And Tom Miller and that group, kudos to them. They're really working hard and doing a very, very good job. So we have started to realize some of the synergies we expected to have. It doesn't mean it's smooth sailing, but overall, I've always tried to say you prepare for the worst but you hope for the best, right? You are hopeful, but you have to make all of the as conservative estimates as you can of how things will go. And as I said, they're going well. We have a stellar board for the UFL Health. As you know, we have Bill Ballard and Pat Malloy and Junior Bridgman. I could go on and on. Rick Riney, I'm not going to mention every single one of them, but a really all-star board. Heidi Margulis. So they're in addition to our own internal people who are on there. So I feel very good about the direction of the hospital. I'm also spending a lot of time on the finances, as you can imagine. We, as you know, instituted a multi-year budget. We didn't have it. It used to be not very transparent and difficult to see. I would encourage you to watch the videos that I've had Dan Durbin do, because I said, okay, Mr. CFO, you need to explain it all. People need to see every penny when we say we're doing well or poorly. What segment is being hit, how, why, and how are we responding? And I think he's done an outstanding job to outline that. That's something else. And then finally, a lot of work with external constituencies, as you can imagine, trying to talk to our students, faculty, and staff, because it's not just COVID-19, but the whole discussion around equity in our society and racial divides and what role does a university play and what role should a university play, both in encouraging free speech and debate of ideas, and at the same time recognizing it's true for most of you. Not all of us were born right to riches. A lot of people, the way the path out for them was education. And so to talk about how do we make sure that access and opportunity to excel is available for our students. And I would say, going back to the mentoring committee, something that I really hope all of you will help is, it's a challenging time for all of us. None of us has seen anything like we are now. And think about how unnerving it is to young people who are in college today. So anything you can do, even if it's just I offer to call and check on a student, would be greatly appreciated. Jake, any other questions?
Neely, you may have said this and I missed it, but we're going to have live classes you're planning out at U of L.
Correct.
Is there any age restriction on your faculty member? If it's an older faculty member, would you have that older faculty member do it by distancing?
Actually, we have a whole committee that's working on that. Most of those decisions are probably made at the unit level, where we have said to a department, we need to make sure that you have at least 50% of your classes some sort of hybrid. Because believe it or not, the most vulnerable students that we're talking about that have the least resources, and others also really want to be back on campus. So for faculty, we're saying 50% can be online and then 50% hybrid, so that it's some element of, we might meet once a week in person, and then one class might be a discussion. So it's really being decided at the unit level.
Well, I congratulate you, because as you know, the great Harvard closed down their classes. How would you like to be paying that tuition, strictly distance learning?
It's actually, the interesting thing is that for a university like us, for them, they have the infrastructure that will have no, the fixed cost is already covered for them. For us, online classes are actually, quite candidly, just as expensive or more expensive to deliver, and it's more work for our faculty. We did do it. We were the first university in the Commonwealth to say we were going to go online, and in 4 days, our faculty moved online. But all summer they've been working on, it's not just delivering your lecture online, it's preparing for, the pedagogy is different. How do you keep them engaged? What do you do? So I'm extremely grateful to our faculty and proud of them. It's not easy, but we will make it through.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Anything else? Well, thank you, and I will turn it back to our president.
Thank you very much, Neely. Last on the agenda, and perhaps most important in today's meeting, is our discussion with Dr. Teresa Reed, our Dean of the School of Music, regarding race amidst current events taking place in our country and in our own community. I'm delighted to have her speak with us today. I too would like to thank John McCall for making this happen, requesting that this happen, and calling to our attention. And Teresa, if you're ready to begin, the floor is yours. I see you have a computer. Are you going to stand here, or are you going to go? Okay, I'm going to pull this microphone out, and you've got yours over here on the left. Perfect. Thank you, ma'am.
Unmasked. So thank you again very much for the invitation, for the opportunity to be here. Probably, yeah. Well, thank you so much. So thank you again. I'm glad to share some thoughts with you that I hope will inspire a sense of optimism and a sense of possibility that transcends the racial tensions that are so prevalent in our news today. And I would talk off the cuff, but in student evaluations of 20 years, I've been told that I ramble. So I am going to be reading from a script to keep me centered, so we're not here until Friday, okay? So please observe a few things to start. Number one, I am profoundly unqualified to do this. Let me just put that out there. I head the School of Music, that's my job. Secondly, my perspective as an African American is not authoritative, but I do believe that my perspective is typical. And thirdly, whether you are white or a person of color, racist systems harm all of us, despite the differing degrees to which we're aware of this fact. In August 2010, celebrity talk radio host Dr. Laura Schlesinger, popularly known as Dr. Laura, is anyone familiar with Dr. Laura? Okay, took a call from the Black wife of an interracial marriage who was distressed at her husband's dismissal of his friend's racist remarks. Dr. Laura derided the caller for being hypersensitive, pointing out that Black comics on HBO and famous Black rappers and other entertainers use the N-word all the time. To make her point and to ask what the big deal was, Dr. Laura repeated the N-word several times in rapid succession for her national radio audience to hear. She asserted that if Black people could use the N-word, then she should be able to use it as well. And why should anyone find this offensive? It was 2010, and Dr. Laura further lamented that even with a Black president, there was, quote, more complaining than ever, end quote, from Black people. That broadcast went viral, sparking quite the firestorm. Dr. Laura lost sponsorship and within days resigned from her radio show. The flashpoint around Dr. Laura's use of the N-word underscores a common dysfunctional pattern when we attempt to communicate across our differences about race. Buried within her offensive remarks and hidden within its painful impact was a very legitimate question. And I suspect that somewhere in her heart, she really wanted to know the answer. If the N-word is so offensive, why do Black people themselves use it? If I were white, I would likely find it profoundly confusing, as did Dr. Laura, that Black entertainers use the term and make money, while whites use the same term and lose their credibility and their jobs. If I were white, I would also likely suffer from a sort of blindness intrinsic to the privilege that characterizes my very existence. It would be enormously difficult for me as a white American to comprehend how my own critical knowledge gaps help to fuel the racial discontent that fills our news and makes race so hard to discuss. So today I want to talk about two paradigms, the first of which fails us repeatedly, and a new paradigm that I believe holds promise for moving us all closer to the table of brotherhood that Dr. Martin Luther King described in his dream in 1963. So the graphic that's up, if you would go to the prior one, the prior slide, shows the old paradigm. Yes, the current paradigm, which illustrates why race, conversations about race are either repeatedly stalled or are difficult to have at all. And I should pause here and mention that everybody got, thanks to Jake Beamer, a collection of materials as an email attachment, and the slide deck, that's only 2 slides, is also in those materials. So the graphic represents the current paradigm, which illustrates why conversations about race are either repeatedly stalled or difficult to have at all. So if we look at the cycle included in the paradigm, we start with a knowledge gap, which goes to a flashpoint. And then after that, there's an outcry, followed by a consequence. And there is a retreat and an abandonment. And then we end up back where we started with the knowledge gap. The case of Dr. Laura matched all 5 phases of this cycle. Here is a white woman who meets every metric for membership in this country's elite, yet she suffers from an acute deficiency in her knowledge about the dynamics of race. In speaking with her caller, she exposes her knowledge gap, expresses her curiosity, and asks, albeit offensively, a very legitimate question about the racial disparity in usage of the N-word. Curiosity about race often comes from a genuine place with all good intentions and a simple desire to know. However, because there have never been any educational structures to inform white people and equip them with the interpersonal and conversational skills necessary to present their curiosity, or to formulate or contextualize their questions, or to otherwise safely and appropriately expose gaps in their knowledge, many white Americans with even the best and noblest of intentions have no way of gauging the impact of what they express, however innocently that query may have originally been formulated. This is exactly what happened when Dr. Laura expressed her confusion and curiosity about why she couldn't use the N-word. When her radio audience heard her defiant, repeated use of the N-word, Black listeners, not exclusively, but in particular, experienced her discourse as an attack, a flashpoint that triggered a reaction, not just to that particular broadcast, but a reaction grounded in a broader context of centuries-old trauma with which that particular word has long been associated. So if you look at the graphic, we start with a knowledge gap. The result of exposing that knowledge gap is a flashpoint. And then off to the side, there is a reference to a 400-year history of both visible and invisible trauma. So just hold that in place. There was an outcry, followed by the consequence that Dr. Laura's show lost General Motors as a sponsor. Finally, she retreated by quitting her show, and in public at least, abandoning her curiosity, which brought us right back around to the knowledge gap that she started with in the first place. The tragedy here is that if Dr. Laura is brave enough to expose her knowledge gap again, or if she happens to do so unintentionally in the run of conversation, unless something changes, this cycle is likely to repeat. When we speak about race-based educational disparity in this country, the traditional assumption is that people of color are exclusively on the losing end of the spectrum. We usually reference the historical denial of educational access and opportunity to people of color, an inequity that the Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1954, for example, was intended to help correct. The troubling racial and political polarization in our country today, however, makes it abundantly clear that deficiencies in education have impacted our country in much more widespread and complex ways. Until now, relatively little attention has been given to race-based educational disparity from the opposite lens. While Black Americans began to study, learn, and practice the histories, the norms, expectations, and worldviews of whiteness from birth, an immersive, multi-directional education that we get from nearly every type of consumption, from school to popular culture and mass media, and from the experience of navigating through every dimension of upward mobility, white Americans, in turn, get virtually nothing of a comparable education about Blacks and people of color. Our country's power structure makes it not only possible, but in some ways advantageous even, for white Americans to ascend to the most prominent levels of educational, political, economic, and military achievement with little to no exposure or experience that properly informs them about people of color. The problem, therefore, isn't simply racism. The problem is widespread ignorance. Through no fault of their own, white Americans are born into and suffer for much of their lives from a state of educational bankruptcy when it comes to understanding the histories and perspectives of Blacks and other people of color, and moving beyond stereotypes to make real sense of why we do the things we do. To fix this, let's embrace a new paradigm. So if you would go to the next slide. I'll talk through these captions and then we'll actualize this. So there is the knowledge gap and flashpoint, but instead there I say whole space for the flashpoint, because there is again that 400-year history of visible and invisible trauma that we'll talk about in a second. But instead of going straight to outcry, we do something different. We go to what I call risk, teach, and learn. And then from there, clarity and understanding, which leads to empathy, trust, and friendship. And I say friendship because I think we've gotten it wrong. For a long time, the conversation has been about tolerance. But when it comes to human beings, I think tolerance is a pretty low bar, and I think that we can do better than that. So, in my mind's eye, I've replayed the scenario with Dr. Laura again and again, and I've imagined a different kind of exchange, and as a result, a different outcome. I imagined that through some weird and unlikely turn of events, I'd actually have the opportunity to meet Dr. Laura face to face. In reality, there's no way or reason that our paths would ever cross, but work with me, I'm just kind of using my imagination. Maybe I'd run into her at the airport and our flights are canceled and we're both trapped there with lots of time and drinks and snacks and no place else to go. So I imagine myself striking up a conversation with her because despite her debacle of 2010, I actually like her as a person and I see her humanity. I'd introduce myself, put her at ease, buy her a cup of coffee, and I gently guide her back to her unanswered question from 10 years ago. So Laura, what I heard you saying is that you'd really like to know why Black people get away so easily with using the N-word, right? Legitimate question. I gently touch her shoulder, maybe reassuring her that curiosity is a good thing and that it's safe and okay to ask. And I take my time with the good explanation that she deserves, because race is a topic too sensitive and complex to address in a soundbite or a factoid or in a few politically correct cliches. As her newfound friend, I would give her a clear, thorough, and non-judgmental explanation to resolve her confusion as to why African Americans use the N-word sometimes, but she cannot. And I would give her an explanation using this analogy. Imagine that your two legs are exactly the same, except that one leg is encumbered and the other one is not. One leg is free and flexible with the ability to bend and move and dance however it wills. The other leg, however, is bound by a 400-pound ball and chain that is excruciatingly painful to drag along. Every effort to move that leg is a reminder of all that burdens, oppresses, and constricts it. The N-word is linguistically unique in this country in that it derives its meaning most powerfully, not from its etymology, nor from context, nor from vocal inflection, but it derives its meaning most strikingly from the person who utters it. When African Americans use the N-word, it is completely deracialized. That is to say that the sting and the poison are absent. When used by Blacks, the N-word can have a range of meanings and can even be a lighthearted term of endearment. It's a norm of African American culture to redefine and repurpose, and this is evident in our cuisine, in the way that we do religion, certainly in our music, and in our use of language, whatever is at hand to serve creative or expressive function. In the same way that we've transformed, for example, pig intestines into a coveted delicacy, we call them chitlins, language has also been at our disposal to flip on its head, turn inside out, and make it mean what we want it to be. That freedom and flexibility is an African American expression, is like the flexibility and fluidity of the unencumbered leg in our two-leg analogy. I would explain further to Dr. Laura that when someone white utters the N-word, by contrast, its meaning instantly transforms. When spoken by a white voice, the N-word automatically triggers the history of oppression at the hands of white hegemony and the resulting inequality that persists through to the present day. Upon white utterance, the N-word connects to the brutality of bondage and the heartbreak of families splintered and spouses and children bought and sold as chattel during slavery, to Jim Crow segregation that persisted through the 1960s, to redlining in real estate, to lynching, to mass incarceration, police brutality, voter suppression, and other painful realities of past 4 centuries, the impacts of which are still felt today. That's the other leg in our two-leg analogy, the one bound by the heavy ball and chain. So you see, Laura, I would explain, this is why your use of the N-word was so problematic. But I forgive you because you were disadvantaged by a system that did not properly teach you, and therefore you simply didn't understand. I imagine that over coffee, both of our cups now refilled for a second and third round, Dr. Laura and I are continuing our conversation, and we're beginning to let our guards down as she feels free to follow up on another one of her comments during her infamous radio rant. She feels that our discussion is safe, so she asks, you know, in 2010, Barack Obama was president. I thought Black people would be satisfied, but they seemed angrier than ever. Instead of complaining, why didn't Black people just celebrate such wonderful progress? Some questions may appear so naive as to sound insulting, and it may take effort for me to resist the pattern of perceived attack that activates the other phases of the dysfunctional cycle, thereby threatening to abruptly end our conversation, derail our new friendship, and stall the progress of dialogue in a pothole of hurt, anger, and distrust. Again, that old pattern really doesn't get us anywhere. So I make a different choice. And I make this choice because it is only for myself that I have the power to choose. And at times it may feel counterintuitive and may take real purpose-driven effort. I then explained to Dr. Laura that while we certainly celebrated this important first, Barack Obama was also distinguished as the only president whose American citizenship was challenged in a series of ongoing, highly publicized legal and political gestures that predated his presidency and continued for nearly his entire time in the White House. In 2004, Illinois politician Andy Martin became the first to suggest that Obama was not American. In 2008, Clinton supporters circulated emails questioning Obama's citizenship, which ultimately forced Obama to publicly release, for the first of at least 2 times, his birth certificate. The same year, a series of lawsuits were filed challenging Obama's eligibility for the presidency based upon doubtful citizenship. In 2009, a highly publicized Kenyan birth certificate purported to be Obama's appeared in the media and on eBay. In April 2011, Obama released his long-form birth certificate. Despite this, from 2011 to 2016, Donald Trump led the birtherism charge, questioning Obama's citizenship repeatedly during televised interviews and encouraging his base to do the same. Finally, in September 2016, Trump sheepishly conceded that Obama was born in America. I would say then to Dr. Laura, so you see, Obama's presidency was both an important first and a painful reminder that if you are brown in this country, you can ascend even to the presidency and still be viewed by too many as unworthy, inadequate, and imposter. I sense that Dr. Laura is neither malicious nor hateful, and she may not even be a card-carrying racist. Instead, Dr. Laura's dilemma, her problem, simply put, is ignorance that she inherited from the condition of her privilege. And sitting with her here over coffee in a quiet space, I have the power, if I'm willing, to begin to address her ignorance and to help guide her in filling her knowledge gap. My imaginary exchange with Dr. Laura, where her knowledge gap is not ignored or minimized, but it's addressed and curiosity is resolved, realizes the phases in this new paradigm that I propose. Knowledge gap, they exist. Space for flashpoint, because there's stuff in there, there's some trauma. But risk, teach, and learn. Believing that the knowledge gap was not of her own creation. It's just a factor of a system and not of people so much, which gets us to clarity and understanding, and finally empathy, trust, and friendship. And with each repetition of this cycle in the new paradigm, the knowledge gap gets smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And that is how we chip away at racism. Many of you have read the letter that I shared with my School of Music family that described a way forward on race. Since then, we've been meeting in what I call safe Saturday sessions each Saturday morning from 9 to 10:30, because that's the only time that I have, on a Zoom call where anyone in the School of Music and other interested friends can safely ask anything at all about the Black experience and receive non-judgmental response. I usually begin with some framing conversation, then we open for free dialogue, and I conclude each session with a list of bare facts that afford participants points of departure for doing further investigation on their own. There are other African American colleagues from the School of Music on the call, and we share our perspectives and the information we have. Maybe I'll never get to have that conversation with Dr. Laura, but I can certainly get to risk, teach, and learn with those in the unit that I serve. And in your email, the other materials that you have are materials from the first 3 of our Safe Saturday sessions that include answers to some questions and then the fact list for each week. The first question we dealt with the N-word. The first week we dealt with the N-word. The second week, I think we talked about identity and naming. So people wanted to know, what do you call Black people? And so we did just like a really brief history lesson on that. The last week we talked about diversifying organizations and there are a list of questions around that. So that's just a Zoom call, anybody can join. So where do we go from here? If you're someone white who finds yourself ready to access the information and the education about the Black experience that you never received, what can you do? First of all, be okay with not knowing. It's not your fault. You must recognize that racist structures depend on two things for their survival: the perpetuation of inequity and the perpetuation of misinformation. A racist system works both by denying opportunities to people who look like me and by denying education about me to people who look like you. Secondly, notice the Black people in your circle, and if there are no Black people in your circle in 2020, ask why that is. If you have no Black friends, I will be your friend. But notice that Black people in your circle have, to some degree, whether it's apparent or not, there is some degree of trauma there. Black communities and Black people suffer today from long-standing, deeply entrenched inequities established during slavery. Most recently, the national news has reported on the killings of unarmed Blacks. But just 2 weeks ago, there was property vandalized with racist graffiti near my sister's neighborhood here in Louisville, a neighborhood that I pass at least once a week. Whether the trauma is from something widely reported or from the microaggressions we experience in the course of more routine activities, many African Americans learn to hold it inside and keep it moving. Like our parents, grandparents, and other ancestors before them, we've learned to suppress trauma and move forward with our lives, achieving what we can, however we can, often drawing motivation from something greater than ourselves, like family or community and faith. I finished undergrad 33 years ago, and my parents still don't know what it was like for me to be Black at an all-white university. And they don't know because their example and my grandparents' example and my great-grandparents' example taught us to hold it inside, taught me to do the same thing. But you should assume that there is some element of trauma there. Recognize that more than anything else, Black people simply want what you want, and that is to be understood. Because if we're understood, then we won't have to convince anyone that our lives matter. Courageously recruit the Black people in your life to be your teachers and facilitators by saying these words: I don't understand. I want to understand. Please help me to understand. In so doing, you destroy a wall, you create a friendship or you deepen an existing one, and you change the world. So I started this talk with the story of a white woman, Dr. Laura, and I'll end my talk today with the story of another white woman whose life and work illustrates the power of daring to engage a worldview that differs from one's own. The year 1850 saw the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, a terrifying law that criminalized harboring escaped slaves even if they lived in free states. This law incentivized not only the capture and re-enslavement of Blacks who had made it to freedom, but also the abduction and sale into slavery Blacks who were freeborn and had never been slaves at all. Outraged by this law, a white woman and New England native, whose family members were outspoken abolitionists, picked up her pen to write. Part of her inspiration came from the slave narrative of Josiah Henson. Excuse me a moment. On June 5th, 1851, the first installment of Harriet Beecher Stowe's story appeared in a newspaper called The National Era. Published in serial form, the newspaper published installments of the story over the next several months after its initial appearance. And her story became a powerful anti-slavery message, the impact of which she could not have possibly fathomed. In 1852, the completed work was published as the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Written in the parlance of its times, the book certainly contains language and perhaps stereotypes that, without question, would be unacceptable according to modern standards. This notwithstanding, there is absolutely no way to argue against the fact that Uncle Tom's Cabin spoke powerfully to 19th century sensibilities about the evils of slavery in a way that no other book did. This book became not only the single most important anti-slavery publication of the antebellum era, but perhaps the single most important American literary work of the 19th century, period, selling in the United States fewer copies than only the Bible. Harriet Beecher Stowe's commitment to freedom for Black people, as expressed in Uncle Tom's Cabin, was her most important and impactful legacy. Uncle Tom's Cabin changed the entire national discourse on Blacks in America. It exposed the horrors of slavery and sparked new critiques of the slaveholding South, igniting new arguments in favor of abolition that before her novel did not exist. The defenders of slavery hated Harriet Beecher Stowe, and they went to great lengths to discredit her work. Nonetheless, the essential message of the book, that slavery is wrong, was delivered with resounding success to a public ready to hear it. And Uncle Tom's Cabin inspired a bevy of other artistic creations, from plays to other literary works, later to movies and to songs, including this one, widely considered in its day to be an anti-slavery ballad. Its lyrics depict the scene in the novel that every 19th century listener would have immediately understood, having been drawn from, would have immediately understood as having been drawn from Harriet Beecher Stowe's book. You might have heard it. It goes like this. The sun shines bright on my old Kentucky home. 'Tis summer, the people are gay. The corn tops ripe and the meadows in the bloom, while the birds make music all the day. Have you heard that before? Drawing inspiration from Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, which, by the way, was set in Kentucky, Stephen Foster composed My Old Kentucky Home in 1853, the year following the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The original lyrics of the song included the term darkies, which in its day was considered more polite than the much more widely used N-word. Be warned, if you read anything from American literature or popular culture of a century or more ago, you will find a wealth of racist language. As scholars and historians, we view these works in the context of their times. We no more expect Harriet Beecher Stowe or Stephen Foster to meet our standards of diversity, equity, and inclusion any more than we would expect for King James to have translated the Bible into 21st century American English. Yet we know that images and words have power, and we're careful to avoid glorifying and perpetuating that which contradicts our values as an enlightened society. Recognizing this, in 1986, the state of Kentucky approved an adaptation of the song that removed the archaic term darkies from its lyrics. Let's not forget, though, that Frederick Douglass himself described and praised My Old Kentucky Home as one of the many expressions inspired by Harriet Beecher Stowe's work that awakened sympathies for the slave and for abolition. In Harriet Beecher Stowe's day, it was popular literature that had the power to expose societal evils and sway public opinion in the direction of justice. Here was a white woman of education and means who could have easily enjoyed a life of leisure and blissful ignorance, safely sequestered within the boundary of her privilege, but she took a risk and she changed the world. In the 1950s and 60s, it was television that had the power to expose societal evils and sway public opinion in the direction of justice, bringing us images of peaceful protesters stumbling beneath the weight and force of water hoses and vicious attack dogs. And in 2020, it's the smartphone that has the power to expose societal evils and sway public opinion in the direction of justice, bringing us images of unarmed African Americans gasping for breath beneath the weight of an officer's knee. So let's join together to create new images for our descendants. Let's tackle our knowledge gaps together. Let's be brave in the face of our flashpoints and triggers and our trauma, and let's adopt a new paradigm and get to risk, teach, and learn and create a better world. Thank you. Or stay. Okay.
Dean Reed, I want to thank you for courage to put on paper pain that you felt, death of George Floyd, to express in a very constructive way your feelings about how we could together deal with racism in our country, talking about how we can talk candidly about it. I must say I was a little disappointed that it took someone new to Louisville to write down those thoughts so eloquently. I would have been pleased if those same thoughts had come from someone who was here. Nonetheless, they are valuable observations, and you have taught us the importance of trying to educate ourselves about Black culture and Black experience in order to understand better the emotion and the anger that goes with things like what happened to George Floyd. All of us who saw that were outraged, heartbroken, deeply hurt by it, because that was not a Black man or a white man, that was a human being who was suffering, and it could just as easily have been my son or someone else's son. I say that, and that's not true. It took it to be a Black man to suffer that consequence. But there are people like you who are trying to expand this discussion and participate in your comments today to the President's Council, Catherine Higgins, who invited members of the President's Council to her home at 26 in West Chestnut to talk about race and talk about injustice. And I compliment you both for having the courage to do that. And I hope we as a President's Council will find a way to continue the discussion well beyond today and to add constructively to solutions here in this community and perhaps more broadly. Thank you.
You're very kind. I should reiterate that I'm no expert. I have no credential or qualification. I think that there is much more expertise with my colleague Faye Jones, who's here. But we are at a unique moment, I believe, in our history. It's a different moment that I think is intensified by COVID, because COVID requires us to be detached from one another. So we can't even have normal conversations about normal things, but that as an additional layer to the racial unrest in this country really intensifies our ability to navigate this differently, I think, than at any other point in this history. So the commitment to getting on the other side of this, not just on the other side of COVID, but to do things differently so that we don't recycle through the same process again and again. Since the death of Trayvon Martin, we've kind of seen the pattern of the old paradigm activated several times, where there's really an event that brings to the surface this trauma that I'm talking about, which exposes knowledge gaps, which leads to an outcry and flashpoint, an outcry, and then there is offense, inevitably, that causes us to retreat and back away from each other. But I'm hopeful now that we do something other than back away from each other. Thank you.
So we have a question online. How is it possible for members to join your Saturday Zoom sessions? Is that something that we can share with them?
I suppose, yes. And logistically, I'm going to need a little help with that. Would it be appropriate for me to ask you, Jake, to collect email addresses and then I can just, add those addresses to the call?
Happy to.
Okay, thank you.
Another question, similar. Is it possible to get access to your written speech? Someone asked that.
It is.
Okay, so we can follow up with them and the council as a whole later.
Yes, what I think I would like to do, if I could send that to President Bendaputi's office to dispense as she wishes, that'll be fine.
I like the eloquent John McCall found your essay to is eloquent and moving. And I truly understand the issue that Dr. Laura didn't understand and should understand, because as a fellow member of the Jewish faith, well, I am, a lot of Jewish men will tell each other jokes that we only want to hear a Jewish. I mean, I really understand that. Correct me if I misunderstood you. Did you say that Harriet Beecher Stowe's book in many ways was politically incorrect at the time and was, and even under today's vision of today's appropriate use of language and literature, it might be considered politically incorrect from today's point of view?
I think let me repeat your question to you to make sure that I understand what you're asking. So I believe what I hear you saying is that you're asking whether Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, if read with a 21st century lens, would be considered objectionable.
That's correct.
Okay, and I would say yes if. And it would be considered objectionable if it's read with a 21st century yardstick and decontextualized, if it's taken out of its native time and transplanted into 2020 in accordance with the things that we know are acceptable and unacceptable. If we remove that book from its historical placement and we transplant it into a historical placement that does not fit it, then it would be highly offensive. And here is where a liberal arts education is extremely important, because what the liberal arts education does is give you the skill set to contextualize and synthesize and understand how history and literature and art and social sciences and all that stuff come together to give the backdrop that makes sense out of what we're reading. So if I were to treat Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel as an artifact of my own time, then the outcome of how the reaction would be there would be completely different than the reality of how 19th century readers read it. And therein lies the problem. There's been a lot of literature really kind of castigating Uncle Tom's Cabin because it's filled with stereotype and it's rife with racist language and all of that. But let's consider a few things. First of all, in the 1850s, Harriet Beecher Stowe was incredibly unique as someone who was able to present a narrative that was recognizable even to somebody like Frederick Douglass, who had been a slave. So he did not object to her book because he too was a part of those times. And so if we understand, I use the analogy of the Bible. Nobody in everyday language today says thee and thou and art, and we don't talk like that anymore, right? That's because in his time, King James had a single linguistic toolkit, and that was 16th century English. If we were to indict King James for not translating the Bible into 20th century American English, that would be very odd because 20th century American English didn't even exist at the time that the Bible was translated. Right. I use that analogy to make the point that to her readers, Harriet Beecher Stowe's writing fit within the common parlance of that day and would not have been found offensive. The other point is to not miss the forest for the trees. So if we back away from the minutia that might be considered offensive and look at the impact and the bigger story of what she wrote, then you have to honor what she achieved. And what she achieved was that she sparked the conversation about abolition that without which I might not be here today. So that's the part of contextualizing that piece of literature properly so that we don't indict it unfairly, and also realizing that there were African Americans who spoke in the same parlance. James Bland was a composer who wrote Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, a similar very sentimental song that became the state song of Virginia, and that had some of the same objectionable language in it. And if you want to complicate that even further, there are recordings of the famed contralto Marian Anderson singing Carry Me Back to Old Virginia with the original lyrics. What do you do with that one? So there again, you have to have the savvy to contextualize these artifacts of history, thinking about their impact and to whom they were speaking in their day, while understanding that it may not be appropriate to translate or to copy and paste those works into modern times without giving the proper contextualization.
Well, I really appreciate that, that intellectually interesting and profound response. Now, I'm not trying to, I'm just having a dialogue here.
Yeah.
We are a great nation found by imperfect people. Would you consider people have to be judged by the context of the times in which they lived and how they acted within the context of those times? The monument mania to take down Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, etc. Can't we look at their actions many ways the way we're looking at Harry Beecher Stowe, that in the times they did great things. They founded this country, and shouldn't we understand them as part of history as opposed to trying to demean, deface, and so forth?
Well, that's a really good question. And my response is that I'm not so sure we really understand the history properly.
We're not sure we're understanding.
I'm not entirely sure we understand the history properly.
Okay.
Because if I were to ask about the Washington, D.C., for example.
Washington, D.C.?
If I were to bring that topic up, many Americans don't know that the White House and most of the early federal buildings were constructed by slave labor. The White House was built by African-American, overwhelmingly by African-American free and slave labor. The early federal buildings constructed overwhelmingly by African-American free and slave labor. Many of the colleges and universities that have really begun to look carefully at their architectural histories are finding that those buildings were constructed by free and slave African-American labor. And there's this other history that has not been entirely unearthed. So that's part of our dilemma, is that when we get a telling of history, inevitably we get it told with a bias. And that's human nature. We all do that, right? So the folks who had the literacy and the ability to create narrative and transmit narrative were not the people who were building things. They were not the people who were picking cotton. They were not the people who were paving roads and picking tobacco and building railroads. They were the people who had the access and the means and the privilege to put those narratives forward as the authoritative ones. It's only now that with more access to information and literacy and technology, it's only now that we're able to see that there's another side. So the problem, though, does go back to our old paradigm. Let's take that issue of toppling a statue. If you go back to the old paradigm, it fits exactly this cycle that we're talking about. So there is a knowledge gap. And I'm going to use as an example, a pretty common one. Let's use the example of Christopher Columbus. So I was taught, like most people my age, that Christopher Columbus was a hero who discovered America. And there are many monuments around this country, whether they be statues or paintings or other kinds of tributes to Christopher Columbus for that wonderful achievement. But that telling alone is indicative of a pretty profound knowledge gap, because the other data, the other history, the other set of facts that we have is that Christopher Columbus also we can point to him as being kind of responsible for famine and disease and impoverishment and displacement of Native American and indigenous communities in this country. And he also participated in the slave trade under the Portuguese flag. So there's this whole other side of Christopher Columbus that really doesn't give us a balanced picture of who he was. So when people topple that statue, there's a flashpoint around that, because the folks that Christopher Columbus was told, that he was a hero. The selection of Christopher Columbus as a hero was made without the input of many of the people whose lives were impacted by his choices. Therefore, there's some trauma there's a flashpoint, and then we go straight to outcry. Let's knock over the statue. The problem there is not that the statue is retained or knocked down. The problem is that we don't know enough about it to make sense of it. So it seems abrupt, it seems disrespectful, even with the argument that the toppling of Confederate statues is disrespectful to our country, is really indicative of a real knowledge gap, because Confederate soldiers were not advocating for our country. They were advocating for the Confederacy, which was a different country. They were, in fact, opposing this country, so they were enemies of this country. And yet, in that case, we have narratives that are crafted both on knowledge gaps and on cognitive comfort more than on fact.
Well, this is a great discussion. I think you should be on one of the commissions, and some of us should be, because this is one that I think is more divisive than it needs to be. And I appreciate your responses.
Thank you very much.
So we have a question. Could you, Dr. Reed, please explain why Black women don't want to be called girl and Black men don't want to be called boy? Mm-hmm. And this comes from a reporter.
Okay, thank you so much. Excuse me a moment.
A reporter.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's a really good question. So in antebellum times, it was very common for slave owners to refer to adult women as girls and adult men as boys. And so if we look at the collection of labels that were affixed to enslaved Africans, in one of the handouts that you have, I have a collection of them there. I won't repeat them because they are objectionable. But there are some, one of the terms that was used not only to address enslaved Africans, but to address them in a particular way that minimized their value, minimized their legitimacy, minimized their intelligence, minimized their humanity, was to refer to adult men and women as though they were children. That reference, boy, girl, for adult Black men and adult Black women, survived and was common in the sharecropping era, which covers a really big span of history. Following the end of slavery, the Reconstruction period was a period during which many African Americans who had been slaves had no option but to continue sharecropping on the same land where they had been enslaved. And very often they had children on that land, and their children had children on that land, and so forth and so on, so that well into the 1960s and 70s even, you can find some families in the South who trace their ancestry to enslavement on exactly the same land where they were sharecropping. What resulted from that was a new kind, was really slavery by a different name, because the sharecropping system meant that those African Americans were perpetually indebted. So the obvious question is, well, why didn't they leave? Well, they didn't leave because they were charged for tools and for seed and for animals. They were charged to work the land, which created a system of perpetual and cyclical indebtedness, which meant they could not leave unless they escaped in the middle of the night. And we're talking about the 1940s, 50s, 60s. So the dynamics between the white landowner and originally white landowner and slave, but then white landowner and sharecropper remained pretty much the same. So that well into the middle of the 20th century, if you wanted to denigrate someone who is African American and reinforce that inferiority, you would find it pretty common for a well-baked, fully adult male to be referred to as a boy, and an African American woman to be referred to as a girl. So that's the history behind that, and that's the reason why those terms might be offensive. Now, in context, it's not necessarily offensive. So if I walk over to Faye and I say, "Hey girl, how you doing?" That's a completely different contextualization because we are peers and we're not, that's a deracialized contextualization. And if you're white and you walk up to me or to Faye and you use that designation, unless you have an intimate relationship with us, that's a good, solid, intimate, mutual friendship, that may not come over well. So I hope I answered that question.
So this question came from Mary Gwynn Wheeler. She asked if we had your permission to share your original letter more widely with our community in the hopes that we can prompt some of the conversations that you've been suggesting.
Absolutely.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks today. My name is Joe Artery, and one of your materials we received, you said it's okay to talk about I and bring your whole self to the conversation.
Absolutely.
I had the good fortune to grow up in Louisville in a stable family with a good father and a good mother, and we prized liberal education, and you made positive remarks about liberal education and the importance of people to encourage others to get a liberal education, and those of us who have a liberal education to bring our whole selves to encounters with each other, so that if there is a flashpoint, we take some risk and we listen as well as teach, and we learn from each other and we have a real dialogue. I had the very good fortune after graduating from a high school here in Louisville to take a year off. The Vietnam War was going. I joined the Air National Guard, and I went to basic training at an Air Force base in Texas. And then I went to technical training at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver. In Denver, I was in a barracks of 52 men. There was a barracks chief, and I was the assistant barracks chief. He told me that he was 3/4 African American and 1/4 Cherokee, and he was from Cleveland. And in our barracks, about 45 of the 52 men were African American or mixed and looked black. We got along together great. I was a white minority guy for the 5 months. I slept in the upper bunk. He slept in the lower bunk. We would go to the Airmen's Club and drink 3-2 beer and talk about music and women and stuff that guys that age talk about. He liked to talk about the Temptations and Motown. I was a member of his group. We drank Canadian Club and 7-Up and lived that life. And it was a good experience being a minority person within a black community. They were very kind to me. There wasn't any anger at all. There wasn't a feeling of resentment that they expressed towards me. There was relaxed friendship. Flash forward. You go to Harvard College, you graduate in English literature, Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude, come back to Louisville, work in politics, work in the mayor's office, help select a new police chief. That was what I did. Went to work for a law firm. And I'm proud of the Brandeis School of Law here at Louisville. Great school. Louis Brandeis was from Louisville. He was appointed by Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a real racist. He helped create the Federal Reserve. He helped create the Federal Trade Commission. He did many things that progressives like, but he was really a racist. And it's been documented again and again and again. I read Melvin Urofsky's 800-page biography of Louis Brandeis. Great book about a great man whose ashes are on this campus. I saw him leading on certain progressive issues, but he was silent, just about silent on African American issues. So he wasn't perfect either. Nobody's perfect. People should be looked at in the context of their times. Brandeis should be. His ashes should not be torn out because he was appointed by a racist. If Princeton chooses to rename things at their school, that's for them to do. But I hope that you and everyone in this room, because all of us have liberal educations, will be liberal and will be fair and will cut everybody in the past a little bit of slack. And if someone goes to a flashpoint and tears a monument down, I hope the liberal educated people will say, stop, don't destroy, add. When I was in college, I read Howard Zinn's History, People's History of America. I'm sure you've read it. It was a progressive work in the 1960s. Great book. What people ought to do with Columbus and the others is add knowledge, add knowledge, add knowledge, add knowledge, not destroy. That's my view.
I'm all for adding knowledge. I believe that that's our enterprise as an educational institution. And there's never a moment at which I think anything is not fair game for critique, and that is not fair game for critical analysis. And I believe that we absolutely, that's part of our mission and our charge is to add knowledge. What we often do in this country and what we often do with the structure that we have is that we envision the real estate available for discovery as a pie. So that the pie means that if a certain slice goes to one direction, that equal amount is denied to the other direction. And we deal with this in academia all the time when we make decisions about what to teach. And so the eternal tension is between whether we should teach for depth or whether we should teach for breadth. Because if we have too much on the plate, that means if I do teach, for example, about American popular music, there's less room left for jazz. If I do teach about this history A, that there's less room left for history B. And I think that that's one of the fears that anyone who's an educator has to encounter. And I think that is similar to part of the fear connected to the prospect of adding knowledge where none exists. And one of the things that I remember very, very clearly as someone who came of age during the 80s when terms like multiculturalism and diversity were first becoming buzzwords in educational institutions was, number one, the fear that people were going to be required to teach things that they didn't know. And that's terrifying for a scholar. And the secondary fear of, even if we do learn this other stuff, these other histories, these other perspectives, where are we going to fit it into the curriculum? So part of our dysfunction is an either or mentality, that we either have to embrace a particular history and a particular telling and sort of hold on to that territory, or we have to swing all the way in the other direction and completely erase history A from the menu in order to treat history B. And that's really kind of a broken paradigm because it's possible to develop the skill of interrogation and critical analysis Developing that skill set means that it doesn't matter what the content is. It doesn't matter whose history it is. If we develop the skill set to interrogate fairly and objectively and critically the facts before us, then we will make the room. We'll create the room to think about our heroes in ways that make space for those who are unsung. Okay. Okay. Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much.
I just want to thank all of you. I know that these are important conversations. I want you to know that Teresa, as she self-disclosed, this is not what she studies. She is an incredible dean of music, and as you saw, but her letter was so moving that I thought, and since John asked, I thought it's a good idea. There's no one person who can speak for the entire Black experience. And it's not true that everybody agrees on every single thing, right? In anything, you have all of the nuances. But I wanted you to hear the perspective of somebody who's agreed to join us and is adding so much to all of us. We are embracing an anti-racism agenda at the university. What does that mean? It means that it's not enough to say, I am not a racist, because I don't believe any of us really wants to be or is, but that we can speak up, that we know how to address the very real inequities in our society. How do we address the fact that the median household, a Black household's wealth is 1/10 that of a white household? And to me, education is the way out. How are we going to provide those opportunities? All that to say that as we discuss this, I read some of these books. I do not agree with everything that's said. I want to ask the same of you. As we said, let's read it critically. It is to challenge ourselves. We may not agree with every single thing we read. In fact, I'd be shocked. But to say, what do I agree with? What do I not? What are my blind spots? And what are my, personal flashpoints where you say, whoa, 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 that's going too far. But to have what you said, I loved it, where we risk, we assume the best of one another, and we teach, and equally importantly, we listen and we learn. So I'll keep you posted. We're happy. There's so many incredible scholars at U of L. We can bring different people to speak to this if you're interested. And again, you won't agree with everything that's said, nor should you. But the more conversations we have, I think the better off all of us are. That's all. Charlie, back to you.
Thank you, Neely. I couldn't have said any better, and everybody's comments were, it's a great conversation. It's a shame that it's taken us this long, I guess, to have the conversation. I think our country's probably had a lot of false starts, but maybe this is something that is going to push us forward, and conversations like this are exactly what we need. Dr. Reed, thank you so much for coming here and talking to us. Come back again. I know you're a music teacher because I heard you sing, but that was my only hint into that. I went down to Catherine Higgins' house and visited with her for a little while, and I would encourage you all to take her up on that. She and I had a great conversation. We sat there for a couple hours. It was very enjoyable. So if you're so inclined, I would strongly encourage it. So there's nothing else that we have here today. No other business. We are adjourned. Our next meeting is October 27th. Yeah, October 27th. And Jake's going to get with you on the details. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thanks, everybody.